Karen thought she was in control. She had her first-class seat, her privilege, and the belief that she belonged where others did not. But when she complains about the wrong kind of passengers sitting in first class, she sets off a chain of events she never saw coming. What begins as an entitled outburst turns into a journey of reckoning, one that will shake her to the core. Stripped of her comfort, forced to face the truth, and confronted by those she once dismissed, Karen's world starts to crumble at 30,000 feet. And by the time the plane lands, she won't be the same person who boarded. But does she learn from it? Or does she continue to fight a battle she can't win? Watch until the end to find out. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The cabin hummed with quiet luxury. Passengers in first class reclined in plush leather seats, sipping champagne, flipping through newspapers, or tapping away on laptops. Flight attendants moved gracefully, ensuring every request was met with precision and warmth. Karen adjusted her designer scarf, peering over the rim of her first-class seat with a look of increasing agitation. Her manicured fingers tapped impatiently on the armrest as she scanned the cabin. There were too many of them, too many black passengers sitting in first class. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with a professional but weary expression. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice tight with forced politeness. "There must be some mistake. This is first class, correct?" The flight attendant nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Is there an issue with your seat?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "No. The issue is that I paid a premium to sit in a place where I wouldn't have to deal with." She gestured vaguely toward a well-dressed black couple a few seats away. "Well, this." A tense silence followed. Several passengers turned to look. The black couple, a middle-aged man in a tailored navy blue suit and his elegantly dressed wife, exchanged glances but remained composed. The flight attendant stiffened. "Ma'am, all passengers in this cabin have purchased their seats. Is there something specific you need assistance with?" Karen huffed. "Yes, I need to know why they are sitting here. First class is supposed to be exclusive. What's the point of paying extra if they just let anyone in?" The hum of quiet conversations in the cabin faded. People were listening now. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice," the attendant said, keeping her tone professional. Karen scoffed. "Oh, so now I'm the problem? Unbelievable. I want to speak to someone in charge. Get me the manager, or better yet, the pilot." A slow, deliberate voice cut through the air. "I believe I can help with that." A man sitting just across from Karen removed his reading glasses and folded his newspaper. He was black, dressed in a sharp, well-tailored suit. His presence exuded quiet authority. He met Karen's gaze with measured calm. "I'm the chairman of this airline," he said. The blood drained from Karen's face. "My name is Daniel Carter, and I take great interest in how my passengers are treated," he continued, his voice even but firm. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone coughed awkwardly. Karen swallowed hard. "You joking, right?" Carter's expression remained unreadable. "No, ma'am. I assure you I am not." Before Karen could stammer out a response, a chime sounded overhead, and the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. It has come to our attention that a passenger on this flight is engaging in behavior that goes against our airline's policy of inclusivity and respect. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. If necessary, we are prepared to make an unscheduled landing to escort this passenger off the aircraft." Gasps spread through the cabin. Karen turned bright red. "You can't be serious." "Just because Carter held up a hand. Ma'am, I would advise you to stop talking. Every word you say is making this worse for you." Karen's hands curled into fists. She had never been spoken to like this before. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Would you like to change seats, ma'am? We can certainly arrange that." Karen's eyes lit up. Finally, someone was seeing things her way. Yes. Please, get me away from this. The flight attendant nodded and gestured toward the back. Right this way, ma'am. Karen gathered her purse and stood, feeling victorious until she realized where she was being led. Not to another seat in first class, not to business class, but to a tiny fold-down jump seat next to the flight attendant's galley, right next to the lavatories. The laughter that followed was quiet, but unmistakable. Karen's nightmare was only just beginning. Karen stared in disbelief at the cramped jump seat tucked against the galley wall. The narrow space was nothing like the luxurious first-class accommodations she had enjoyed just minutes ago. The scent of reheated airline meals lingered in the air, mixing with an occasional whiff of the lavatory nearby. This must be some kind of joke, she muttered under her breath, crossing her arms. The flight attendant maintained a professional smile, but didn't waver. Ma'am, this is the only available seat at the moment. Since you requested a change, we thought you'd appreciate the opportunity to sit somewhere separate. Karen clenched her jaw. She glanced over her shoulder at first class, where the passengers she had complained about were now chatting comfortably, sipping drinks, and pretending she no longer existed. She had expected sympathy. Instead, she had been made an example of. With no other option, Karen squeezed herself into the jump seat. It barely had any cushioning, and she could already feel her lower back protesting. The seat belt was a thin strap that cut into her waist as she adjusted it, and to her horror, she realized she would be facing the flight attendants for the remainder of the trip. The lead flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, gave her a cool glance. Let me explain something, ma'am. This seat is usually for crew members who work hard to serve passengers, all passengers. We don't normally place guests here, but given your concerns about your previous seating arrangements, we made an exception. Karen felt her face flush with embarrassment. But I didn't mean before she could finish. The sound of the lavatory door swinging open interrupted her. A man in his mid-50s, slightly disheveled from hours of travel, stepped out and gave Karen an apologetic look as he adjusted his belt. The unmistakable scent of air freshener and something much less pleasant wafted over. Karen gagged. Oh, come on. The flight attendant patted her shoulder. It's a long flight, ma'am. I hope you brought something to read. As if on cue, the plane jolted slightly from turbulence, causing Karen to grip the armrests instinctively. The intercom chimed again, and the captain's voice came through. Folks, we're hitting a patch of rough air. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Karen's stomach twisted. It wasn't the turbulence, it was the growing realization that she had truly lost control of the situation. She turned back to the flight attendant. Okay, I changed my mind. I'll go back to my original seat now. The flight attendant didn't blink. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't have passengers switching seats during turbulence. You'll need to remain here for now. Karen exhaled sharply, gripping the thin armrests of the jump seat. This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am? The flight attendant's lips twitched. Actually, we do. Karen frowned. What does that mean? At that moment, another crew member handed the lead flight attendant a small tablet. She glanced at it and then turned the screen toward Karen. Karen's stomach dropped. On the screen was her airline profile linked to her frequent flyer account. A large red banner now flashed at the top. Passenger under review. Restricted status pending. Karen's mouth went dry. The flight attendant leaned in slightly. Mr. Carter, the chairman, has already flagged your account for review. This means your membership benefits, including access to first class, are being evaluated. You may find it difficult to book premium seating in the future. Karen felt like the walls of the plane were closing in. You can't do that, she hissed. The flight attendant tilted her head. Actually, ma'am, we can. Our airline has a strict policy against discrimination, and Mr. Carter takes that policy very seriously. You might want to consider your actions next time you board one of our flights. Karen's breaths came in short bursts. This was beyond humiliating, it was a complete loss of power. A flight attendant near the galley took a step forward. She was a young black woman, her uniform crisp and her expression unreadable. She studied Karen for a long moment before speaking. "You know," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I grew up hearing stories about people like my grandmother being forced to sit at the back of buses, being told they didn't belong. People fought hard to change that. And yet, here we are, decades later, and you thought you could decide who belongs where?" Karen had no response. The flight attendant gave a small, humorless smile. "Looks like history just flipped the script on you, ma'am." Silence. Karen turned away, staring at the wall of the galley. The smell of airline food and the occasional flush of the lavatory behind her were now the least of her concerns. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. Who is the mysterious passenger about to take Karen by surprise? And how will it change everything? Karen sat rigidly in the cramped jump seat, her arms crossed so tightly it felt like she was holding herself together. The indignity of it all gnawed at her, being removed from first class, the quiet humiliation of having her airline status flagged, and worst of all, the smug glances from the flight crew as they continued their work. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm despite the occasional bump of turbulence. The passengers in first class were enjoying their meals, the clinking of cutlery and soft murmurs of conversation drifting back toward the galley. Meanwhile, Karen was stuck between a lavatory and a wall, her discomfort growing by the minute. She had spent years working her way up the social ladder, ensuring she was always surrounded by the right kind of people. And yet, here she was exiled like a problem child, discarded to the most inconvenient corner of the plane. Her thoughts were interrupted when a deep, smooth voice cut through the cabin noise. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Karen glanced up, her irritation evident, ready to snap that of course it wasn't taken, only to freeze when she saw the man standing before her. He was older, likely in his 60s, with neatly groomed silver hair and an effortless air of authority. His sharp brown eyes studied her with quiet amusement, as if he had seen this scenario play out before. His tailored suit suggested wealth, but his presence radiated something more, a quiet power, an unspoken history of battles fought and won. The flight attendant gestured toward the small fold-down seat across from Karen. "Of course, sir. Feel free to sit here during turbulence." Karen frowned. "Sir?" Why was the crew speaking to this man with such respect? And why did something about him feel oddly familiar? As he settled into the seat, the man let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, life is funny, isn't it?" he mused. Karen stiffened. She had no interest in small talk. "What's funny?" she asked coldly. The man studied her for a moment before responding. "How things have a way of coming full circle." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the armrest. "You remind me of someone I used to know, back when I was younger." Karen let out an exasperated sigh. "I really don't care." The man smiled knowingly. "Of course you don't." He leaned back slightly, seemingly unbothered by her attitude. "But I'll tell you anyway." Karen rolled her eyes, but said nothing. The man's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "Many years ago, I was a little boy sitting on a bus next to my mother. We were told to move, to give up our seats for someone who looked like you." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "I remember how tightly my mother gripped my hand, how her voice didn't waver, even when the driver threatened to have us removed." Karen swallowed, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go down. The man continued, his voice steady. "That was the day I learned what dignity looked like, and what cowardice sounded like." He tilted his head slightly. "You sound just like the people on that bus, you know." A suffocating silence filled the space between them. Karen's hands clenched into fists. "That's not fair," she muttered. "I didn't." The man held up a hand. "No need to explain. I've seen this story before." Karen wanted to argue, to push back, to reclaim some sense of control, but for the first time in her life, words failed her. The flight attendant returned, standing beside the older man. "Would you like anything, sir?" He shook his head. "No, thank you. I just wanted to stretch my legs." He stood, straightening his jacket, before looking down at Karen one last time. "You should think about what you've done today," he said, his voice kind yet firm. "Because the world is changing. And people like you, you're being left behind." With that, he turned and walked back toward first class, where he was greeted warmly by the passengers Karen had tried so hard to distance herself from. Karen stared at the empty seat across from her, her chest tight. For the first time, she felt something new. Not just humiliation, not just anger, but something dangerously close to shame. Is Karen finally starting to see the truth? Or is this just another bump in the road? Karen sat frozen in the cramped jump seat, her thoughts swirling like a storm she couldn't escape. The older man's words echoed in her mind, clashing against years of ingrained beliefs and the deep-seated entitlement she had always carried with her. "People like you? You're being left behind." She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Who does he think he is? Comparing me to some bus driver from decades ago?" And yet, no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, the weight of his story lingered. The intercom crackled, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering an area of turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Karen groaned as the plane jolted, the movement forcing her back against the hard seat. The flimsy seatbelt barely gave her a sense of security. In first class, she would have been in a spacious, cushioned seat with plenty of legroom. But now, every bump in the air felt amplified, like a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen in just a few hours. A sudden dip in altitude made her stomach lurch. The flight attendants braced themselves, remaining calm, but Karen's pulse skyrocketed. She gripped the armrests, as if her life depended on it. The lead flight attendant, the same one who had escorted her to this miserable seat, crouched down beside her. "Ma'am, are you feeling okay?" she asked, her voice steady but unreadable. Karen exhaled shakily. I hate turbulence." The flight attendant nodded. "It'll pass. Just breathe." Karen swallowed hard, unwilling to admit that she was genuinely afraid. The plane shook again, and this time, a tray of plastic cups rattled loudly in the galley. Another sharp drop. Karen let out a small yelp before clamping her mouth shut. The flight attendant was still watching her, as if waiting for something. "Not so easy back here, is it?" she finally said, her tone mild but pointed. Karen scowled. "Excuse me?" The flight attendant leaned against the wall, arms crossed. People always assume first class means superiority. But when the plane starts shaking, when you feel the same fear as everyone else, it doesn't really matter what section you're in, does it? Karen looked away. "I don't see how this has anything to do with." The plane jolted violently, cutting her off. Her heart pounded as oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments throughout the cabin. Panic set in. Gasps filled the air. And for the first time, Karen saw fear in the eyes of everyone around her: passengers, crew members, even the flight attendants who had been so composed just moments ago. The intercom crackled again. "This is your captain speaking. We've encountered unexpected turbulence. Please stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are handling the situation." Karen's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her seatbelt, making sure it was secure. She wanted to scream, to demand reassurance, to do something. But she couldn't. She was powerless, just like everyone else. And that realization terrified her more than the turbulence itself. A warm hand suddenly covered hers. Karen looked up, startled, and found herself staring into the eyes of the young black flight attendant who had spoken to her earlier. "It's going to be okay," the woman said softly. "We've got you." Karen blinked. Why was she being kind? After everything? A lump formed in her throat, but before she could process it, the turbulence began to ease. The violent shaking turned into a light rocking, then finally, stillness. A few Moments later, the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have cleared the turbulence. Thank you for your patience." A collective exhale swept through the cabin. Some passengers wiped their eyes. Others gripped their armrests a little less tightly. Karen released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The flight attendant gave her hand a final squeeze before pulling away. "See? We made it." Karen stared after her, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Something uncomfortably close to gratitude. The cabin had finally settled, but Karen had not. Her breathing was still uneven, her hands clammy despite the cool, circulated air. The turbulence had rattled her in ways she hadn't expected, not just physically, but mentally. It had stripped away her illusion of control, forcing her to confront an unsettling truth. In the grand scheme of things, she was no different from anyone else on this plane. That thought alone made her stomach twist. She stole a glance toward the first-class cabin, where passengers were now back to their meals and quiet conversations. No one there had suffered through the worst of the turbulence in a cramped jump seat, next to a lavatory, completely at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And yet, her gaze flickered toward the flight attendant who had comforted her. The young woman was back on her feet, adjusting trays, ensuring everything was in order. She moved with the same grace and composure as before, as if the terrifying plunge had never happened. How do they do it? Karen wondered. How do they stay calm when everything is shaking apart? She exhaled sharply, frustrated by her own thoughts. This was ridiculous. She had nothing to feel guilty about. She was not in the wrong. She was about to shake off the lingering discomfort when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You still look a little pale." Karen turned sharply to see the same older black man, the one who had told her the story about his mother on the bus. He was standing nearby, watching her with quiet curiosity. "You again," Karen muttered, crossing her arms. "Are you here to lecture me some more?" The man chuckled. "No, just checking in. That was some rough turbulence back there." Karen scoffed. "Yeah, well, I'm sure you had a comfortable seat to ride it out." The man tilted his head. "Funny thing about turbulence, it doesn't care where you're sitting. First class, economy, flight deck, when a plane drops, everyone drops." Karen frowned, but before she could respond, the flight attendant from earlier returned, handing the man a fresh cup of coffee. "Here you go, Mr. Carter," she said with a warm smile. Karen blinked. "Carter?" The man nodded, taking a sip. "Yes, ma'am." He studied her reaction, then added, "Daniel Carter, chairman of this airline." Karen's mouth went dry. She had humiliated herself in front of the chairman of the very airline she was flying. The man she had insulted indirectly, but undeniably, was the one who owned the experience she had so desperately wanted to gatekeep. And now he was standing in front of her, calm, composed, sipping his coffee like he had all the time in the world. "You should have said something earlier," Karen stammered, scrambling for any sense of control. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Would it have changed the way you acted?" Karen's mouth opened, then shut. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to insist that had she known who he was, she never would have made a scene. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Had she known he was wealthy, powerful, and in charge, she wouldn't have questioned his presence in first class. But the others? The black passengers she had complained about? She had assumed they didn't belong. She had assumed he didn't belong. And now, the very man she had dismissed as unworthy of first class was the same man who had the power to decide whether she would ever fly first class again. Karen swallowed hard. "Listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot." Carter let out a soft hum, considering her words. "Did we?" Karen forced a tight smile. "I was just having a bad day. That's all. Surely you can understand that." Carter took another sip of his coffee, then met her gaze. "Let me ask you something, Miss Karen." She flinched at the way he said her name. "If I had spoken to you the way you spoke to those passengers earlier," Carter continued, "would you accept my excuse if I said I was just having a bad day?" Karen had no answer. She sat in silence as Carter studied her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was simply watching, waiting, giving her a chance to sit with the weight of her own actions. Finally, he set his coffee down on the galley counter. "Bad days don't make people say things they don't believe," he said simply. "They just make it harder to hide what's already there." With that, he nodded to the flight attendant and made his way back to his seat. Karen stared at his retreating figure, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to process. For the first time, she wasn't sure who she was angry at anymore. Karen sat motionless in her cramped jump seat, her mind racing. The turbulence had passed, but inside, she was still spiraling. The chairman of the airline, Daniel Carter. She had insulted the most powerful man on this flight without even realizing it. A bitter taste formed in her mouth. She had spent years perfecting the art of social maneuvering, knowing who to flatter, who to avoid, who to dismiss. And yet, she had miscalculated everything today. She had assumed Carter was just another passenger, someone who didn't belong in first class. And now, she had to face the sinking reality that she was the one who no longer belonged. The lead flight attendant returned, kneeling slightly to meet Karen's eye level. There was no hostility in her expression, just the same calm professionalism she had displayed all flight. "Ms. Karen," she said, her tone measured, "Mr. Carter has requested that we process a formal report regarding today's incident." Karen's throat went dry. "A report?" "Yes, ma'am. Our airline takes matters of passenger conduct seriously, especially when it involves discrimination or disruption in first class." Karen gripped the edge of her seat. "This is ridiculous. I was frustrated, that's all. People get frustrated all the time. You're going to report me for that." The flight attendant didn't react to her outburst. "Our policy is clear. If a passenger engages in behavior that makes others feel uncomfortable or unwelcome, we document it. The decision on further action will be made once we land." Karen's hands trembled. "Further action?" The flight attendant gave her a small, unreadable smile. "It depends. Sometimes it results in a written warning. Other times, passengers are banned from flying with us in the future." Karen's stomach plummeted. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about my job, ma'am." Karen opened her mouth, ready to argue, but no words came out. What could she even say? That it was unfair? That she was the victim here? Even she knew how weak that sounded. She turned her gaze toward first class, where Mr. Carter sat calmly, flipping through a magazine. He hadn't even glanced her way since their conversation. He didn't need to. Her fate had already been decided. Karen slumped back against the wall. She was losing control of the situation, and she had no idea how to fix it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the chime of the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare for landing." A collective rustling filled the cabin as passengers straightened in their seats, gathering their belongings. Karen, however, remained frozen. Her heart pounded as she considered what awaited her once the plane touched down. Would security be waiting? Would she be escorted off the plane like some criminal? Her thoughts were interrupted when the same young black flight attendant, the one who had held her hand during the turbulence, approached one last time. She crouched beside Karen's seat, her expression softer than before. "You know," she said quietly, "you still have a choice." Karen frowned. "What?" The flight attendant sighed. "You can walk off this plane the same way you walked on, angry, defensive, convinced the world is against you." She tilted her head slightly. "Or you can take a second to think about why you're really here. And maybe, just maybe, you'll walk off a little different." Karen stared at her. "What do you mean, why I'm here?" The flight attendant gave her a small smile. "I think you already know." With that, she stood and walked away, leaving Karen with nothing but her own reflection in the small, scratched-up mirror near the galley. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't sure who she saw staring back. The descent had begun, and Karen felt every inch of it. Not just the slow pull of gravity as the plane lowered altitude, but the crushing weight in her chest as she sat trapped in a situation of her own making. She gripped the thin armrests of her cramped jump seat, her nails pressing into the plastic. She wasn't used to this being powerless, being humiliated. She had spent her life making sure she was never in a position like this. And yet, here she was. The plane rumbled slightly as it cut through a pocket of turbulence, the familiar tightening of descent pressing against her ears. The flight attendant's words still echoed in her mind. "You still have a choice." Karen scoffed under her breath. What choice? The damage had already been done. She had lost first class, lost her dignity, and now she might even lose the privilege of flying with this airline altogether. And for what? Because she had spoken her mind? Because she had dared to say what she thought people were already thinking? Her fingers twitched. She turned slightly, stealing a glance toward first class. Mr. Carter was still seated comfortably, casually flipping through a magazine as if today had been just another routine flight. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even paying attention to her anymore. That stung more than anything else. Karen wanted him to acknowledge her. She wanted him to be wrong about her. She wanted to win. But win what? The plane rocked slightly again, and Karen realized her heart was pounding not from the turbulence, but from something else. A thought she had been trying to push away since this whole nightmare started. What if I really was wrong? Her breath caught. No, that wasn't possible. Was it? She squeezed her eyes shut. The faces of the passengers she had complained about flashed in her mind. The black couple who had barely reacted to her outburst. The businessman she had mistaken for just another passenger. The flight attendants who had treated her with more patience than she had ever deserved. Even the young woman who had comforted her during the worst of the turbulence. None of them had raised their voices. None of them had met her anger with anger. They had just existed, and that had been enough for her to see them as a problem. The realization made her stomach churn. The landing gear deployed beneath them, a dull funk resonating through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be touching down shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions." Around her, passengers straightened up, closing books, adjusting seatbelts. The atmosphere had returned to the calm normalcy of travel. But nothing felt normal to Karen anymore. She exhaled shakily, staring down at her hands. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to blame someone. She wanted to believe she had been treated unfairly. But deep down, she knew no one had done this to her. She had done it to herself. As the runway came into view, stretching out beneath them, Karen swallowed the lump in her throat. She didn't know what would happen when they landed. She didn't know if she'd be banned from flying with this airline. She didn't even know what she would say if given the chance. But for the first time since this flight began, she wanted to find out. The wheels touched the ground with a soft but firm impact, the plane slowing as the engines roared. Karen closed her eyes. This flight was over. But maybe, just maybe, something else was about to begin. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, and Karen's stomach twisted tighter with every passing second. The moment she had been dreading was here. Landing was inevitable, and so were the consequences. Passengers around her stretched, unbuckled seatbelts, and reached for their belongings, chatting about their next destinations. To them, this was just another flight. For Karen, it was a reckoning. She glanced down at her trembling hands. How had things spiraled this badly? She had boarded this flight certain of her place in the world. First-class ticket in hand. She had belonged there. But now, after a few hours, she had been stripped of that certainty. Worse, she had been forced to see herself through the eyes of others. And she hadn't liked what she saw. A sharp ding from the intercom announced their arrival. The flight attendant's voice was polite but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination." Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." Karen's breath hitched. A uniformed airport official had entered the plane and was speaking with one of the flight attendants. The way they both glanced in her direction made her insides go cold. They were here for her. Karen gripped the edges of her seat. She had seen videos of passengers being escorted off flights, their faces plastered across the internet, mocked, judged, ridiculed. That can't be me. That can't be me. She swallowed hard. What if they arrest me? What if I'm banned from flying entirely? The thought sent a ripple of panic through her chest. She turned toward first class, searching for Mr. Carter. He was still seated, calm as ever, sipping the last of his coffee. He hadn't even acknowledged the commotion. Karen hesitated, then forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like jelly, but she steadied herself. The lead flight attendant approached, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Karen," she said, her voice professional but lacking warmth. "Please wait here. You'll be escorted off the plane last." Karen's heart pounded. Is that really necessary?" The flight attendant arched an eyebrow. "After the disturbance you caused?" "Yes." Karen clenched her jaw, her mind scrambling for anything to regain control of the situation. But she had none. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the usual rush of passengers filling the aisles began. But unlike every other flight she had taken, Karen wasn't part of the first-class crowd exiting with confidence. Instead, she had to stand there, waiting, while every single passenger walked past her. Some shot her curious glances. Others, particularly the black passengers she had initially complained about, didn't spare her a single look. And somehow, that was worse. Even the young black flight attendant, the one who had held her hand during turbulence, passed by without a word. Karen's throat tightened. Finally, the cabin emptied, leaving only the crew, Mr. Carter and her. The uniformed airport official stepped forward. "Ms. Karen, please come with me." Her mouth was dry as she nodded stiffly. She turned toward Mr. Carter one last time. "Sir, He closed his magazine and met her gaze. For a moment, she thought he might say something, offer her some words of reassurance. Maybe even tell her that this wasn't as bad as she thought. Instead, he simply gave her a small nod. Not of pity, not of anger, just finality. Karen's chest tightened as she followed the airport official off the plane, her steps heavy with a shame she had never felt before. The air in the jet bridge was cold, but not as cold as the realization sinking in. She had come onto this flight thinking she was better than everyone else. She was leaving it knowing she wasn't. Karen's footsteps echoed through the jet bridge, each one heavier than the last. The uniformed airport official walked ahead of her, his posture rigid, professional. He hadn't spoken since they left the plane. She wanted to ask what was about to happen, but the words stuck in her throat. The terminal came into view, bright and bustling with travelers moving in every direction. To them, she was just another passenger disembarking from a flight. They had no idea what had just unfolded at 30,000 feet. Karen almost wished they did. At least then, she could defend herself, explain how this was all blown out of proportion. That she wasn't really racist. She had just been frustrated. That she didn't deserve whatever punishment was coming. But deep down, a gnawing voice in her head whispered, "You're not the victim here." The official led her toward a side corridor, away from the main crowd. The shift in direction made Karen's pulse quicken. She had assumed this would be a simple reprimand, maybe even just a warning. But as they moved into a quieter section of the terminal, reality set in. This was serious. A door labeled Airline Security and Passenger Relations came into view. The official swiped his ID badge, and the door clicked open. He gestured for Karen to enter. Her stomach twisted, but she stepped inside. The room was small but professional: glass walls, a long wooden table, and a few chairs. A large airline logo was displayed on the back wall. Sitting at the table was a woman in a navy blue suit, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Her name badge read, Monica Lewis, Senior Airline Representative. Karen barely had time to sit before Monica spoke. Ms. Karen, she began, her voice cool but controlled. We need to discuss your behavior on Flight 247. Karen swallowed, forcing herself to nod. Of course. Monica folded her hands on the table. Let's start with the facts. Multiple passengers, crew members, and our airline chairman Mr. Carter himself reported an incident of disruptive behavior and discriminatory remarks toward fellow passengers. Karen's fingers curled into her lap. I was just expressing a concern. I didn't mean for it to. Monica raised a hand, silencing her. Ms. Karen, intent is irrelevant. What matters is impact. And the impact of your words resulted in a documented complaint against you. Karen's heart pounded. A documented complaint? Monica nodded. Yes. And given the nature of this incident, our airline has reviewed the case thoroughly. Karen sat up straighter. You mean you've already decided? Monica met her gaze evenly. Yes. The room felt unbearably small. Monica slid a formal letter across the table. Effective immediately, your frequent flyer status with our airline has been revoked. Additionally, you are placed on our no-fly list for an indefinite period. Karen's breath caught. No, you can't do that. Monica didn't blink. We can, and we have. Karen snatched the letter, scanning the words, but they blurred together. Frequent flyer account termination, restricted from future flights, violation of passenger code of conduct. This isn't fair, she burst out, slamming the letter onto the table. People say worse things all the time. I was just. Monica's expression remained unreadable. Discriminatory behavior is not something we tolerate, Ms. Karen. Our airline prides itself on inclusivity, and we do not allow passengers who make others feel unwelcome. If you cannot respect all passengers, you will not fly with us. Karen felt heat rise to her face. So that's it? You're banning me from flying forever. Monica sighed. Not forever. Indefinitely. You may appeal the decision in the future provided you show genuine remorse and a change in behavior. Karen let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so now I have to prove I'm a good person? Monica tilted her head. You had that opportunity the moment you boarded the plane. Karen's jaw clenched. She wanted to argue, to yell, to threaten legal action, anything to claw back some control. But deep down she knew the truth. This wasn't about a single moment. This was about who she had been for a long time. And now, she was facing the consequences. Monica stood, signaling the meeting was over. A representative will escort you to collect your baggage. I suggest you make alternative travel arrangements. Karen's pulse pounded as she rose stiffly from the chair. Alternative travel arrangements. For the first time in her life, she wasn't welcome somewhere. And it wasn't because of them. It was because of her. Karen walked through the terminal in a daze, dragging her carry-on suitcase behind her. The words from the meeting still echoed in her head. No-fly list. Indefinitely banned. Alternative travel arrangements. She had flown first class for years, treating the experience as an unspoken right rather than a privilege. And now in the span of one flight, she had lost it all. No more airport lounges. No more priority boarding. No more champagne at 30,000 feet. Instead, she was just another traveler stranded in an unfamiliar airport, forced to find her own way home. The bustling crowd moved around her, unconcerned. No one knew or cared that she had been somebody just a few hours ago. She had always assumed that status and wealth made her untouchable. But now, stripped of the prestige of first class, she felt small. She reached the ground transportation area and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she opened her rideshare app. As she requested a car, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Even if she made it home, what then? Would she just pretend this never happened? Act as if she hadn't been escorted off a plane? As if she hadn't been humbled in front of an entire cabin of passengers? Could she even pretend anymore? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black sedan. The driver stepped out, a tall woman with short curls, wearing a navy blue blazer. Karen hesitated for a moment. The woman was black. She immediately hated that the thought even crossed her mind. The woman opened the trunk, then smiled warmly. "Need help with your bag, ma'am?" Karen swallowed. No, I've got it." She placed her suitcase in the trunk herself, then slid into the back seat. As they pulled onto the freeway, the driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Rough day?" Karen let out a breathless, bitter laugh. "You have no idea." The driver chuckled. "Airport travel can be stressful." Karen nodded absent-mindedly, staring out the window. The city lights blurred as they sped down the highway, her mind replaying everything that had led up to this moment. Finally, she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" The driver glanced at her again. "Sure." Karen hesitated. "Have you ever thought you were one kind of person, but then something happened and made you realize maybe you weren't?" The woman hummed thoughtfully. "That's a big question." Karen sighed. "Yeah." The driver was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I think we all have blind spots. Sometimes it takes a moment, an uncomfortable one, to help us see them." Karen swallowed. "And what if you don't like what you see?" The driver smiled softly. "Then you change it." Karen let the words settle. Change. The concept felt foreign, terrifying, but also possible. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she stopped fighting so hard to be right and instead tried to be better. As they neared her destination, she pulled out her phone and hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she opened a search engine and typed, "How to unlearn racial bias." The page loaded. A list of articles, books, and resources appeared. Karen's pulse quickened. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in her life, she was willing to take the first step. Karen's story is a reminder that sometimes the hardest lesson is the one we never expected to learn. Change isn't easy, but it starts with a single step. What would you have done in her situation? Do you think she can truly change? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening stories.